And we decided to focus on the middle hour of conversation. Turns out that Americans are like everyone else on the planet, and you can have a meeting at a certain time, and there's not a chance in the world that everyone is going to be there. And so if the first half hour involved people sort of arriving and continually saying hello to each other, and the last half hour people are leaving because there are children to attend to or something they have to do, and they're getting tired. So we decided to focus on the middle hour where we felt we had the most intense and highest quality conversation. Now, I don't know if you can read these or not. I'm not sure. Is it too small? What? It's okay. For those of you who do not happen to speak Spanish, basically what is happening in this first conversation is they're beginning to talk. This is, for me, a typical example of a conventional discourse as one element of what's going on in the conversation. They're trying to talk about what might be a goal of education, and they've decided that they want their children to be competent actors in the economy, that they should understand how to sort of negotiate life as someone who has to provide for themselves and their family, etc. And they begin to talk about what an economic actor needs, and what you see in this discourse is the people only barely talking to one another. Each person is adding something new and not really addressing what is happening to the person before them, what has been said by the person before them. This can, because in such a conversation, there is an underlying presupposition that each of us always understands what somebody else has said. That's characteristic of a conventional conversation. Meaning is never problematized. And it produces a result. Am I moving through that slide too quickly? Okay. It produces a result of the kind here. Here we have, it's Diana and Cindy, and they're talking to one another. And Diana has raised the problem that she feels that American children are being socialized into members of a consumer society. And this is a bad thing. It's a bad thing because it makes them too anxious, it makes them competitive, and so what she wants them to do is to become much more sophisticated in how they listen to media messages, more sophisticated and more critical. Cindy picks up on the need to be sophisticated about the use of media. But Cindy is interested in children being taught on how to better use computers at school. That's the media for her. And they now start talking. And they're talking back and forth, one of them about one thing, one of them about the other. And these are completely disconnected, although they are talking to each other. And in the end, what isn't, well, it's sort of included here, is eventually there is a recognition that something has gone wrong. But it's not well negotiated. They don't figure out exactly what each was understanding and now how to proceed from there. They just recognize there's been some miscommunication, that's it, and we move on. The type gets smaller and smaller as we go. This is an example of moments in the conversation which are cooperative. Tom is interested in completely revamping education, and he's saying that all education should be presented from a historical point of view. It's really a rather radical view, in fact. And he believes that essentially as you move from first grade through 12th grade, that you would move through the history of knowledge, starting off with an understanding of philosophy, literature, mathematics, and science that is essentially ancient Greek, is I think the way he was thinking about it. And you would teach the development of these disciplines as the ideas developed through history. So that you would get social history and the history of the ideas of mathematics and science and religion evolving together. Quite ambitious, interesting idea. He's talking a lot. In conventional discourse, particularly in groups, you don't get to talk a lot. People who talk too much are breaking a rule of interaction. The notion is you have short things to say which everybody understands. He recognizes that people might not be understanding what he's saying, and he's typically speaking in a more elaborate way. And what often happens when you have a structure of conversation, because up until now, for the preceding 15 or 20 minutes, the conversation has been conventional. He's trying to push it in a new direction. Cindy steps in and tries to marginalize what he's doing and say, look, Tom, you're being radical, and the group in support of her starts laughing. Most of the time, this kind of move works to prevent the conversation from breaking the pre-existing rules, which up until now have been conventional. However, Richard steps in, and he's supportive of Tom, and both of them have relatively high status in the conversation, and they are able to push through Cindy, who is also powerful, and they continue the conversation. And he is asking Tom exactly what he means, and eventually he stops Tom, because he said, Tom, you're talking about a means to an end, about talking about history in order to provide some kind of better understanding of things which you have not defined. And we are now at the part in our conversation where we are interested in the goals of education, not the means whereby we're going to get these goals. And Tom accepts this organizational constraint on his discussion. So this is a typical cooperative discussion twice over. Now the thing that's interesting is in 7 hours of people talking to one another, how often do they talk one way or another? 2 groups, 7 hours each group, 14 hours of conversation. The result is that people talk to one another in a conventional way almost all of the time in those 14 hours. We found 14 minutes in which people seemed to be engaging one another in a cooperative fashion. We were rather shocked at this result. In terms of its implication, the one thing I wanted to point out just now is the way in which people were constrained. There was occasional attempts on the part of various participants in each group to change the rules of the conversation. They began to speak at greater length. They began to ask for more organization. But at each time, there was a way in which others moved to marginalize them. Laughter was very powerful in this regard, or some kind of ironic or joking comment. But essentially, they were herded back into accepting the parameters of conventional discourse. This has implications for argument and negotiation, but I will leave both. Well, I'll stick with this. What is interesting, since most of the conversation was conventional, part of it was cooperative, is the way in which these conversations tended to construct the individuals as social actors in this context. In a conventional conversation, these people did acquire given social status on whether they were men or women. Gender turned out to play not a very important role here. Women were at least as powerful as men in these conversations. But some people had more expansive vocabularies, higher levels of education, and they clearly received more deference as a result. Also, people were very quickly identified as relatively liberal or relatively conservative, and alliances emerged and were sustained on those bases. I think this conversation has clear limits to it. It does not deal with difference well at all. To the degree to which people have culturally or subculturally different understandings, different values, these cannot be negotiated. In such a conversation works when we all understand things similarly and we all share basic values and preferences. To the degree to which preferences vary, that creates divisions among the participants in the group. In the cooperative context, the individual is constructed rather differently. They're much more abstracted from the specifics of their cultural background or specific social status. They really are regarded as a sort of thinking individual who is involved in this participation. Relationships that emerge are more cooperative. They tend to be negotiated as people move along. And if there are alliances, they're clearly shifting alliances. There is no sense of these subgroup loyalties that emerge, but shifting alliances as people are working their way through specific problems. There's still limits to this conversation, because although they can negotiate meanings and elaborate themselves very well, what they can't understand or have difficulty adjusting to is after the elaborations if people still don't understand one another. It's hard to recognize the limits of the understanding that can be produced. There also is a presupposition that there are fundamental values that we share. And if we can't find our way to those fundamental values, we may have varying different preferences with regard to policy, or different preferences with regard to a particular social goal. But it's always justified in terms of shared underlying values. And if those aren't there, it's very difficult to negotiate. So what were the implications of this? Now, as I mentioned, we started with this group. We're now working in my university. We are a very multicultural university. We are one of the most diverse in the United States in terms of our student population. As a result, we have a whole array of tensions. We have black-white tensions. We have Muslim-Jewish tensions. We have Armenian-Turkish tensions. We have Indian-Pakistani tensions. You name tensions, we have them. And it's very interesting in a context which both advocates multiculturalism as a social norm and yet is very ethnically divided in some of the ways that I suggest. And so there is perceived problems. There is a problem of fragmentation where the various ethnic communities tend to self-isolate, and there is a problem of actual tension and conflict between them. And so what we did is we convened student groups to begin to suggest policy both for students and for the administration to address these issues. So we've expanded this well beyond the purview of this initial research. But what's important for me is what I've said so far is somewhat disheartening for deliberative Democrats. If you take highly educated, highly empowered, highly motivated people, and they are not talking to one another in a very productive way, this suggests some serious limitation in terms of the aspirations of deliberative democratic theory. I would like to make these problems even more serious by briefly referring to the work in political psychology. This is work done by mostly people with a social psychological orientation who, in a meticulous way, have investigated the qualities of how individuals, mostly in the United States, think about politics. And what they find in general is thinking tends to be highly prejudicial, that people start off with prior expectations and beliefs and tend to find those beliefs justified when they are viewing political phenomenon. They have difficulty taking the perspective of another person in conversation, partly because their own way of thinking is so powerfully oriented by these prior expectations